Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Man Seeking Woman. So, we are here to review season 2 of this show. I really thoroughly get enthralled by this show. I think it's still my most favorite show, and ultimately, I'm going to go in and talk about this in a very cryptic like sense, vaguely, just because it's season 2 now. Like, recently, if there was stuff to really go in and talk about here, um, in a very cryptic like sense. Like, I'm still really enjoying the show. I think that there still is kind of episodes that I do not enjoy. Like, there's some stuff where I just feel like they have to like go back to where it's kind of like Josh and Mike ultimately talking about their relationship. We ultimately have it to where Liz is getting her own episode still, which I do enjoy that. Uh, if anything, the only problems of which that I have are kind of just a little bit like it's kind of nitpicky, really. Um, I still think that the jokes are much more solid. I don't think they're going back to the same well on certain episodes, so I can enjoy that. But yeah, so really within these 5 episodes, like I really think that they are still hitting their stride. I think that there is really still um, like there aren't many episodes that feel familiar. Everything feels fresh. It kind of it's still really fun. I'm trying to like figure out words to ultimately say in this cryptic sense because that's ultimately like just me trying to bide time with these episodes because there's a lot more to say within these episodes than there is to talk about it in cryptic like sense. There's so much to get out. Really, we have it to where reasonably in these episodes I ultimately really enjoy how it seems that I think even more in these episodes, there's probably something more for a female audience than there probably was in some of the episodes in first season, with the exclusion of maybe Liz's episode. But I think women and men could probably watch this show and enjoy it. But when looking at it, it's not for everyone. So going into this one, let's ultimately just go into spoilers. There's really not much for me to say. If anything, yeah, we have it to where uh, we get into the journey of at some point Josh having to experiment in one of these episodes, experiment with toys. Let's just say. We also have it to where there are at points in time when Josh and Mike ultimately had a relationship, seemingly at some point within one of these episodes. We also have it seemingly where Josh kind of does no longer give an F at some point, and we have to focus a lot on that. We eventually have Liz seemingly finding a new man in her life in one of these episodes, but ultimately that may or may not go the way we'd want it to. And also, it seems that we have uh, Josh ultimately having a ultimatum upon his career, which to ultimately is to, or which is to have him really go in and really like, well, would you actually want to do something that actually is going to make you money, but is probably going to make you crazy? Or ultimately just make it to where like you think that you're smart at first, but then eventually not so much. So I think that's ultimately all I want to say. So let's go into spoilers because at the end of the day, there's a lot to get out without a doubt about spoilers of these episodes. Because if anything, it's a mouthful of just remembering everything that's going on. And there's also some funny things. There's some funny jokes that I really enjoyed, and I couldn't avoid just laughing at them because that's what this show does. Every single episode, it's hilarious. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this show. So in season 2, episode 1, we have this episode called Wings. Ultimately, this is an episode where we have it to where seemingly Josh is ultimately having a girlfriend that is taking up way too much of his time, to ultimately where Mike is ultimately just desperately trying to put things together for him and Josh to do, but Josh is consistently bailing on everything. We have it to where ultimately Josh is consistently doing things with his girlfriend, to where Mike is just kind of like, dude, like I ordered wings, or dude, like I thought we could smoke some weed, or dude, I thought we could do this. So we end up having Josh consistently texting Mike to ultimately tell him that ultimately uh, him and like he's like sick, or ultimately he just wanted to hang out with his girlfriend, and ultimately Josh is left just in the lurch. So we have it to where forcibly Mike is to go into a seemingly negotiation environment with lawyers and everything like that, to ultimately have Mike demand Josh hang out with him. Like, demand that ultimately, dude, we need to smoke weed every day. We need to at least go and get wings. We need to go and do this and ba 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 ba. And so Josh is ultimately just like, well, uh, like our counter offer is uh, that we can go and get wings. And Mike is like, no! Like, I wanted more than that. Ba, 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 ba. And we have it where Josh is just ultimately just like, dude, you could have had wings, but no, no, not anymore. So we have it where Josh storms off. And we have it where Mike and his lawyers are like, dude, you could have had wings. And he's like, yeah, I know I could have had wings. So we end up having it to where Josh is so with his girlfriend, but eventually that relationship fizzles out. And so we have it to where Josh ends up going like, hey, how about I like try and make amends with Mike? So how about I go and get him wings? So we have it to where ultimately Josh gets Mike wings, and we find out that ultimately Mike and Josh have a daughter. And Josh is like, wait a minute, how is it that we have a daughter? And Mike says, it's like, well, you and me did a little bit of juice, let's just say, in a toilet, and ultimately that toilet was hit by lightning, and that's what created a child. And Josh is like, okay. So we end up having Josh ultimately talking to his daughter, having like a lunch together, and it seems that this girl and Josh are ultimately kind of uh, like we have it to where his daughter is kind of like emo and stuff like that, and like dark shadow under her eyes and stuff like that, and it seems like Josh talking to her are ultimately going to make her like a better girl or whatever like that. So we eventually have it to where Josh and Mike's daughter ending up going off to college, and we have it to where Josh and Mike's daughter is ultimately telling them, it's like, you know what, you guys do look really good together, kind of thing. And we ultimately have it to where Mike and Josh are like, yeah, we do, don't we, kind of thing. And so Josh and Mike's daughter goes off, and ultimately Josh says, man, they grow up so fast. So pushing on to the next episode. So we end up having Josh going to a party to meet a girl, and it seems that Josh ultimately wants to talk about Super Mario Brothers, and we ultimately have it to where some girl dies of boredom. We ultimately have some doctor who is ultimately going, "Oh my God, she had just died of boredom. That is the worst way to go." And ultimately, Josh is like, "Well, she could have just said that she was bored, and like I would stop talking to her." And he's like, "No, that's the problem. That ultimately, like I'm sure she was trying to tell you that, but she just couldn't. Like her mouth could not move." So we ultimately have it to where Josh meets some girl with glasses that ultimately is willing to talk to him about Super Mario Brothers, and ultimately just be enthralled about it. And so now we have Josh having this new girlfriend. It seems that ultimately Josh and this girl ultimately had gone into doing some bedroom business together, and it seems like not quite good enough. So ultimately, they end up going like, well, how about we just start experimenting? How about we just start like going in and going into a adult store, let's just say. And so they end up going into a adult store and going and buying a item there. We end up having it to where they're looking around, and ultimately we have it to where the girl is like getting the most expensive high end toy of sorts, let's just say. And we have it to where Josh is like, well, you have a full blown like me right here. Like you don't need any of that, which ultimately I would strongly disagree. That ultimately every woman needs a toy in their life, let's just say, because when looking at it, like there are several men that ultimately just won't do any number of things that ultimately a woman would want to do. So when really looking at it, have a toy on you. It's okay. Anyways, moving on to my recommendation for a woman to do things that ultimately I barely or rarely have a female audience anyways, so it's okay. Or audience on this channel whatsoever, which is okay. But anyways, moving on. So we ultimately have it to where reasonably going into this, we ultimately have it to where this girl ends up buying seemingly what is called a Kyle. A Kyle is a life-size muscle-bound man that otherwise is seemingly in a life-size Barbie box of sorts that ultimately says Kyle on it. And so we have it to where ultimately now, so this girl buys this Kyle, and so Kyle is just giving it to this girl in this bedroom, and we have it where Josh is just holding on to Kyle, like by the butt or by the thigh or uh, by the ankle, or not even touching him at all, because ultimately the girl is ultimately basically telling him where to move his hand, and that hand is basically completely off Kyle, and so we have it to where Josh ultimately gets out of the room and ultimately is just watching TV where this girl is still like thromping away. And we have it to where eventually Kyle gets out of the room all sweaty and to the point of grabbing like an energy drink and just go to where he spills everywhere on the floor. And we have it to where Kyle goes right back in there. And so we have it to where ultimately Josh and Josh and his girl are ultimately seemingly in the bed together at one point, and we have it to where Kyle is watching over them creepingly, just kind of like looking at them from afar, ultimately just going like, "Hey, do you need me? Do you want me to step in?" kind of thing. So we end up having it to where Josh ultimately is just like, well, there's no way that I can kind of just please this girl, and like it's gonna get to the like to ultimately just be like, well, like I thought that I was good enough, but I guess I just wasn't. So we have it to where ultimately Josh and this girl ultimately break up, and we have it to where Josh is ultimately cleaning out his closet to find Kyle still in his closet, like all dehydrated and ghost white. And Josh is like, "Oh my God, Kyle, why didn't you leave?" And Josh was like, "Well, you bought me. I'm your toy." And so ultimately, I'm gonna stay here until like you tell me otherwise. And Kyle is like, and Josh is like, "Dude, you're free. Like you're free to go. Like I'm not gonna be able to use you. So like go ahead and do whatever you want." And Kyle's like, "Oh my God, I'm free." And it's like a Dobby moment. Uh, and Josh is ultimately like, "Yeah, you're free." And so ultimately we have it to where Josh is letting Kyle go, and so we have it where Josh is mentioning to Kyle like, "Well, hey, what are you gonna do with your life now, Kyle?" And Kyle's like, "I don't know. Maybe I'll go back to Sydney and go to school." And we have to where bizarrely Kyle puts on a top hat and then walks away, and the only thing that he's wearing is a top hat and nothing else. And we ultimately have it to where Kyle does one little look back at Josh and ultimately does like a wink or something like that, and then goes back into walking off. And we have it where Josh is like, "Good God!" So moving on. So we have it to where Kyle. We have it to where Josh is ultimately going to seemingly another club or some place of sorts. And so we end up finding out that Josh is going to the bathroom, and it seems that there's a Reaper within this bathroom. And so we end up finding out that this Reaper is going to seemingly try to attack Josh in this bathroom stall. And Josh is like, "Oh my God, like, are you gonna try to kill me?" And ultimately, the Reaper is like, "No." He's like, "Well then, like, what are you after?" And so the Reaper is ending up cutting off a piece of Josh's hair, and he's like, "Oh my God, am I going to start losing my hair?" And the Reaper's like, "Yeah." It's like, "Well, like, oh my God, I'm going to start growing bald." It's like, well, if anything, I guess there is some like distinguished actors or whatever that like would lose all their hair and would look good. So like Jason Statham and whoever, and so like maybe I can be one of those. And ultimately, like the Reaper's like, "Mm." And like Josh is rambling off all these people where their hair would quite possibly would look good or something like that, or some kind of racial things and stuff like that. Anyways, so we have it to where Josh is like, "Well, how long before I lose my hair?" Because ultimately, like when looking at it, maybe I can try to figure out that I can like keep this all maintained, or maybe I'll have some Rogaine or something, just keep it all intact. And the Reaper's like, "No, you're gonna lose your hair in 3 years." He ultimately shows it on an hourglass, and so we have it where Josh is ultimately freaking out because he had lost a small, tiny piece of hair, and so he's assuming that naturally he's going to be slowly but surely becoming bald, which isn't noticeable at all. But we have it to where Josh is ultimately getting very like subconscious about all this, about him losing his hair, ultimately him having to the fact where he's going to throw on a beanie or some kind of hat to ultimately no longer to no longer have people see his hair. And so we have it to where ultimately Josh is like, "God, like I'm gonna go bald, and I have a temp job, and I'm X amount of years old. Like, God, I have nothing to lose. I have nothing to live for." And so we have it to where Josh is ultimately scrambling to just talk to women and ultimately just go on through this place and ultimately just saying like, "Hey, you want to hit this?" And ultimately, a woman's like, "No," and he's like, "Hey, woman, you and me." It's like, "No." So and we have it to where Josh ultimately hits on a third girl and she says no. We ultimately have it to where Mike is ultimately grabbing onto Josh, and he's like, "Oh my God, you had just been rejected by 3 women. How is it that you're still even alive right now?" And and ultimately, Josh's secret power is that he doesn't give a shit. So we end up having it to where all of a sudden, absurdly, we have it to where all of a sudden there's a lethal weapon sequence that goes in here. We have it to where ultimately Josh and Mike all of a sudden absurdly become detectives. And so we have it to where their detective boss is ultimately going and yelling at them because it's like, "Josh, you shouldn't have gone in there uh, and tried to like get all these women so quickly. Like, you need to really like set things up. Maybe talk about an episode of Game of Thrones, or ultimately going through the name game kind of thing. Like try to try to like butter him up a little bit before you lay that thing on him." And Josh is like, "Yeah, yeah, whatever," kind of thing. And so we end up having it to where ultimately uh, Josh and Mike are ultimately hearing that there is a single girl that ultimately is at this bar, and she's ultimately surrounded by also really hot women, and So really, the only person that could probably talk her down off of this ledge of being single, I guess, is Josh. Which ultimately, she's not literally on a ledge or anything. She's just in this bar and she's single. And so we end up having it to where there is seemingly a ton of all these cops that are otherwise like being in front of this bar, and we have it to where like ultimately we have a police officer that is like trying to come up with like some kind of strategy that they can go in there with, like ultimately to say like, yeah, maybe we should go in there and start talking about the latest episode of Empire. So this girl will ultimately ask like, "Oh, you guys are watching Empire?" And we have it to where Josh is like, "Dude, I ain't gonna do any of that crap." So we ultimately have it to where Josh is to ultimately just stroll in there like he's hot stuff and basically just immediately ask this girl out, and this girl immediately is just like, "Sure, I'll go out with you." And then we have it to where Josh is like, "Whoa!" Like, so we have it to where all of a sudden, like, Josh ultimately loses all of his confidence that he has built up. And ultimately, he's like, "Well, are you sure? Like, are you sure you want to go out with me?" kind of thing. And she's like, "Yeah, I absolutely would." And he's like, "Okay." So ultimately, gives her a number, and everything works out. And we have it to where everybody's like high fiving and everything like that, and everybody's happy that ultimately Josh had landed yet another girl and this and that. So moving on. So we have it to where ultimately Liz is seemingly going on and ultimately like going and working, and it seems that Christmas is coming around, and so we ultimately have it to where everybody is at a Christmas party, everyone's having a good time, and ultimately find that Santa is making his way to uh, appear by Liz. And we end up having it to where Santa is seemingly uh, remembering who Liz is and ultimately going like, "Oh hey, like I remember you asked me for a calculator one year. Like, oh, isn't that nice?" And he ultimately have it to where Liz had done something other than milk and cookies leaving for Santa, and Santa enjoyed that too. So we seemingly have it to where reasonably Santa is consistently uh, leaving leaving messages and all kinds of things to Liz. Ultimately, uh, like telling her at some point when he'll be on in town for business, and ultimately Liz is like, "Oh my god." But ultimately, we have it to where everyone and their brother is telling Liz that like, well, this is Santa Claus. It's like he has a Mrs. Claus. He's married, and Liz is ultimately like, well, yeah, but like we're like so good together, kind of thing. To the point to where like Liz's mother is ultimately confronting in the middle of the street because she bumps into Liz, but then she also bumps into Santa Claus, and we have a tour. Liz is playing it off like they are in some business together, but ultimately, we have it to where Liz's mom ultimately sniffs that out. It's like, no, if anything, I'm sure there's more than business that you guys are doing, and we have it to a reasonably like Liz's mom have to confirm that it's like, well, like he's with Mrs. Claus and kind of thing. So eventually, we have it to where ultimately Liz is to send a letter to Santa Claus and address it to just the North Pole. And we have it to where ultimately Liz is sending Santa Claus provocative photos to ultimately say that all I want for Christmas is you, kind of thing, with all these photos. And so eventually Santa is to get them, or Mrs. Claus is to get them, and ultimately realize that Santa is cheating on her. And so we have it to where Santa ends up going and having an affair with Liz, to where Mr. and Mrs. Claus break it off, and so ultimately Liz ends up with Santa and is sleeping with Santa, and ultimately we have it to where Santa ultimately is starting to become very sick and very ill and all kinds of things. He's not being able to perform as good as he was. It seems that Liz is ultimately telling Santa, it's like, well, hey, are you going to get a job soon? And Santa's ultimately just like, I already have a job kind of thing. And so ultimately we have it to where Mrs. Claus is to eventually approach Santa and eventually take him back. Because ultimately Liz ends up going to the North Pole and ultimately ends up saying that she was wrong, that ultimately Santa needs Mrs. Claus, and so ultimately Mrs. Claus eventually goes and takes Santa back. You ultimately have it to where Santa ends up confessing all the mistakes that he had made, and otherwise is going to land himself back with Mrs. Claus, apologizing to Liz and also apologizing to Mrs. Claus. And so, hilariously enough, we have Mrs. Claus ultimately mentioning what kind of diet that Liz has given him, which is just burritos. And we have it to where Mrs. Claus is like, "Oh my God, are you trying to kill him?" And so immediately we end up having Santa going back to the North Pole, where ultimately we were finding out that ultimately he is stuffed with all kinds of sugar and cookies and all kinds of things, which are ultimately way more unhealthier for him. But reasonably, that's Santa's thing, that ultimately he can survive off of that stuff, and I guess anyone wouldn't normally. So ultimately, I thought that episode was really funny. I thought that it was really interesting, and it was like a bizarre-ish affair going on with Santa, which I thought was hilarious. So, anyways, moving on to the last episode. I know I'm kind of really skipping by through some of these episodes, but when also looking at it, there's a lot to just kind of just mow over through these episodes. These episodes aren't as severely overly there was so much detail to go in all the reviews as there was before. This one is a little bit I can kind of tailor some stuff back and make it a little bit easier for me. So we end up having it to where Josh is to ultimately talk to his boss in this next episode, and we end up finding out that Josh could quite possibly get a promotion of sorts or another kind of job in this company. And so ultimately we end up having it to where Josh ends up taking this job and ultimately going to his mother. Oh my God, I completely forgot about. Oh. I completely forgot about. Oh, yeah. I know what Yeah. Um, So, wait a minute. Let's pull back a little bit. So, in the episode that ultimately is Feather, we end up finding out. I remember this. We end up finding out that the one girl who ultimately had gotten a Kyle and ultimately not wanting to end up being with Josh. We end up finding out that that girl ultimately is just no longer attracted to a guy named Josh. Here's some hilarious moments. So we ultimately end up having Josh and this girl going to this therapist, and ultimately this therapist is ultimately saying, you know what, this is actually really a common thing. It seems like there's a ton of women in the world that ultimately will never go and want to be attracted to a guy named Josh. And so ultimately we end up finding out that there is a no Josh pride parade that is ultimately going on, and we end up having it to where like everybody's going out uh, to ultimately have this pride parade that is ultimately of no Joshes. And so we end up having it to where Josh ultimately stumbles and falls on his face, and we end up having two people at this pride parade ending up helping him up. And we have to where Josh ultimately saying well, why is it that you helped me? Because you're part of this pride parade. And they're like, well, just because that doesn't mean we're completely a-holes. If anything, we'll be able to will help a man that is named Josh, but ultimately will just not have him go inside of us, if you know what I mean. And so ultimately, we have it to where Josh ends up going and seemingly going with his girl to fully be a part of this parade, and we have it to where this girl is ultimately just going like, well, hey, you know what? Like me and you could still be friends, kind of thing. And ultimately, if you want to hang out, that's perfectly fine. And so ultimately, there's kind of a really nice and fun ending at the end of this. At the at the suspense of ultimately Josh ultimately having an entire parade that doesn't want anything to do with him, which I thought was hilarious. So now going back into the card episode. So we end up having it to where Josh again is going to seek some kind of other job within his job, and so reasonably we have it to where Josh is telling his mother about him getting a new job, and we find out bizarrely that his mother and father are ending up uh, throwing together uh, some worship thing. To where ultimately we have it to where we find out that his mother is worshiping him at some point. It kind of reminds me of the one episode where we ultimately have it to where Josh's mom is ultimately doing some talk show where ultimately his father is like a guitarist in some band, and we end up having it to where Josh's mother ends up bringing this couple, Josh and his girlfriend, up to just to interview them, which I thought was really bizarre. And ultimately, I don't think I mentioned that part in any of the episodes, but ultimately, there's only so much to remember. So, but I ultimately just said it now, so good for me. But anyways, we have it toward Josh. His mom is ultimately ending up worshiping him, and ultimately it seems that there's a whole thing going on about people worshiping Josh bizarrely, and I just found that to be weird. But anyways, so we eventually have it to where Josh is going on to try to go into like he has to seek extra schooling to seemingly be better at his job. And so ultimately, it seems that at first it seems like all these schools are going really well. It seems like he has all the answers, but eventually he gets to a point of getting to such a high portion of class to ultimately we have these characters that are ending up having these like gigantic like brains that ultimately are towering over their heads, and we have it to where Josh is like, oh my god, like I'm definitely not as smart and as intelligent as these people, because like dude, I was at like step A and they're at step like Z already, and like I'm so just overwhelmed. And we have it to where ultimately we find that every one of these brain people ultimately have this like hive mind mentality or something like that. So we end up having it to where Josh gets so overwhelmed that eventually he quits this high end game developing thing, and ultimately he goes back to doing his regular job, and ultimately his boss will allow him to do so. And so everything is going to work out for Josh in the end. But like in this episode, it doesn't really seem like very much that they kind of focused on Josh getting a relationship and mostly just focused on Josh and his job, which ultimately I think this episode was kind of a little flimsy. Like I didn't really care for a lot of stuff that was going on in this episode, and reasonably, yeah, like I thought that reasonably this was kind of like it could have been just like a filler kind of thing to just try to do something different. Because ultimately they're just like, how about we just focus on his job for one episode, and then we'll go back to regularly scheduled dating program. And so yeah, that's the thing I liked about these. Those are the things that I liked about these episodes, and there was also some things that I was kind of just like, like I was trying to still be won over on these things. I was ultimately like looking back at the Poltergeist episode, and I thought that was like my favorite episode of the Poltergeist thing, where ultimately like you have the priest that is ultimately telling Josh that he desperately needs to sleep with somebody, and I thought that episode was hilarious. So I've been looking at that, like I'm trying to find an episode that tops that or is as equally as good, and I just don't think that I think I've like found some ones that I thought were funny, but I don't know if it's quite as funny as that one yet. So when looking at that, I think that's all I wanted to say. So I'm going to go out of my way to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.